what they definitely did. Whoever wrote that is right. Tim the Seer for 3 says, Sup Rye, hey man, I tried to imagine what would happen if the South won the war, but all I can really see being different is that it would still be okay to be racist and have slaves. What's your opinion? No, slavery was being phased out already, and that started in the South with people like Thomas Jefferson. It was already on its way out. The cotton gin and wage slavery are the reason that slavery ended. It wasn't some like moral revelation or something. It's just they found a cheaper way to do it. That's the only reason they ever had slaves, was because of economics. Like, nobody could justify the inhumanity of slavery. They were competing over railroads going out west between New Orleans, which is the largest city in the South, to San Francisco, versus Chicago to San Francisco. And the North didn't want the South to have slave labor building the railroads, but they ended up doing it anyway, because they had these free men, and the Irish, Polish, and then the Chinese later, who they brought over as slaves to finish the railroads. So slaves that still ended up building the railroads, they just used Chinese slaves instead of African slaves. And that was the North who ended up doing that. So nothing would have changed that way. The South did want to expand south, so possibly they would have invaded more and taken more of Mexico, as well as the Caribbean, and added it to the Confederate States of America. The North wanted to go west, which is what they did. What would have changed, though? Like, slavery would have ended anyway. It was already on its way out, and invention and wage slavery is cheaper. A slave would have cost about $40,000 to maintain one slave, and that's in today's money. So $400 back then would have been about $40,000, whatever. But it's a lot cheaper to just not pay for someone's housing or food and have them work for chump change, or worse, pay them in script. And what the North did with a lot of the blacks and Irish that built the railroads on the eastern side is they didn't pay them in dollars. They paid them in script. And you could only use script on the company store. And so you're just recycling the money they just paid you back into the company that paid you. And you have to pay for your own housing, and you have to pay for your own food. And a lot of them starved, and a lot of them were homeless, but they were replaceable. So they didn't care what happened to these newly freed people. And, wages plummeted, and they used them as a weapon into the Rust Belt, and it actually increased racial tensions. So it's like, none of that, the whether or not the state is going to have slaves or not was a social issue and an economic issue. It couldn't be legislated away, because even when slavery was illegal, it still continued. They had Chinese wage slaves, and they had script pay. And they didn't get rid of script pay until after the 1920s, from the Blair Mountain Rebellion and the Colorado Coal Strike. And there's a lot of poor white and black people who were sick of living in tents and being paid in script, that fought the federal government. Over 10,000 people with guns. They had to use the U.S. Air Force on its own people. I did a great Blair Mountain Rebellion talk with Sam Tripoli on the Tinfoil Hat podcast. You guys can go look that up later. I will re-upload that one to brand new too, because that's a good one. If you've never heard a script and people getting paid in a script before, I feel sorry for you. I'm sorry your history teachers that didn't tell you that, but it kind of ruins the myth of the Civil War, because it's like, oh, now you get paid, but not in real money. Only money that can be used in certain stores, and the ones we own, But that's what they did. And it was timber and coal and railroading, a lot of things that were owned by, or partially owned by, the state itself. A lot of these railroad companies all got subsidized by the government. Lincoln did that. And let me add something to that. Prior to 1865, not a single road, canal, bridge, or railroad took any state money. It was all venture capitalists. So anytime someone comes at you and like, well, who would build the roads? Well, we built all our roads and all our railroads and all our bridges and canals without a penny from the federal government, all the way up until Lincoln. He's the one that married corporation and state. He is the original neocon. It was a disaster for the public, and slavery would have been out anyway. If slavery was being phased out all over the world at that time, and that question was being struggled with, and they'd already limited no more transatlantic slave trade. They're getting rid of slave trade from the Caribbean. They didn't want to add new slave states. So that's how it was happening. And the South would have given up its slaves anyway, especially with the cotton gin solving that problem of who's going to pick the cotton, right? So, and a lot of, and like you can see that too with the treaties they were already making with Native Americans. Like they gave the Choctaw their own nation state, and a lot of people had freed their slaves during the Civil War anyway. So that was happening already.
I think, Ryan, you should probably do a Civil War kind of like a little mini-series timeline. Just to, because people need to know this stuff. It's so interesting.
You know, the northern states that they kept their slaves during the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery was only ended in the South. All the northern states, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland, and Delaware, and D.C. itself, and the Missouri territories, and Nevada territory, they all kept their slaves. And they all enslaved the Chinese and stuff well after the war. And here's another one. The Corwin Amendment was offered to enshrine slavery in the Constitution if the South would stay in the Union, and they still seceded from the Union. So there was an offer made that they could keep their slaves if they would stay in the Union, and the South rejected it because that's not why they were seceding. They were seceding over the tariff issue. Later, when the 13th Amendment was passed, which is what ended slavery officially, 3 northern states voted against it. So are you really going to have a war to end slavery, and then here comes the resolution the constitutional amendment to end slavery, and you vote against it? They could not ratify it, even without the southern states being part of the Union. Just the northern states, the first attempt at passing the 13th Amendment failed. It wasn't until later, when they got votes from Virginia and other southern states, that they could get the 2/3 majority to make a constitutional amendment and pass it to end slavery. Even the North itself did not want to end slavery when they were not even greatly using it. They didn't want all of the blacks moving up north and working there. They didn't even want to live with them. A lot of Lincoln wanted to send blacks back to South America, or not back to, but to South America. There was a send them to Africa movement. That's why the state of Liberia exists. And Lincoln favored buying up land and sending former slaves to South America. I would quote you exactly what Lincoln said, but it would get me kicked off YouTube because it's racist as hell. But Lincoln and Grant and his Treasury Secretary and his entire cabinet, they were all for the send them to South America movement. And he was saying his opposition to slavery wasn't because slavery was so wrong. It's because he said about the Western territories, if slavery is not allowed in, let's say, Kansas, then blacks and whites will not have to live together. If they don't live together, they won't mix blood together. His idea was he didn't like slavery because he didn't like blacks and whites living in the same place. He wanted them completely separate. He thought the white race was superior. So it's not like this was some altruistic president fighting for the rights of blacks against the evil slave-owning Southerners, whatever. This was a completely white separatist, white supremacist North versus a white supremacist South. They were all in agreement on that, sad to say, except for a handful of abolitionists who had their own economic incentives of hurting a labor force in the South so that you could have a qualitative advantage in the North over industry. It had nothing to do with blacks. Nobody cared about blacks in the 1860s. And you could see the same thing. These same racist Northern generals went west, like Custer, killing American Indians, shooting old men and women. They put young Indian girls up on a stage as young as 9 and auctioned them off. And what would happen is individual buyers didn't get these kids. They would pull their money together, a bunch of cowboys, so that they could win, and then they would gang rape her to death. So that was Custer's corrals. That's the people you have statues of, by the way, in the North. Crazy Horse killed Custer and defeated his entire division, and his statue, his monument, is being built on the backside of our great monument to the presidents on Mount Rushmore. So this idea of like good versus evil, it's crap. Lincoln was a white separatist. They murdered American Indians. One thing that would have definitely changed if the South won the war is we would still have a Native American population, because they had allied with them, the Comanche and the Choctaw, etc. The North wanted that Ohio Valley region. I can't get into that whole history. It's a long thing, but
Well,
anyway.
I think that's what you should do. Is you should do a civil war.